Do you remember when Game of Thrones ruled the world? The show changed TV forever with its brutal storylines, epic battle scenes, and some of the best characters in the history of television. I remember hosting watch parties, and every Monday morning I couldn't wait to look at reactions and theories from everyone I knew. Honestly, it felt like this was gonna be the TV event of our generation. But when it ended with a bit of a stumble, I felt like it actually might fade from the culture's consciousness forever. So imagine my surprise when, instead, it produced one of the best spin-offs we've ever seen. I'm Eric, welcome to Utini, and today, we're gonna see how House of the Dragon can save the legacy of Game of Thrones. I think we forget how amazing Game of Thrones was. For almost a decade, this show had a chokehold on the world, unlike almost any show we had ever seen before. It was a phenomenon in the truest sense of the word, and I don't just mean in popularity. The show was excellent. Over its run, Game of Thrones won 59 Emmys, which is more than The Sopranos, The Wire, and Breaking Bad combined. In the years that it was on, it had fantastic competition like Mad Men, Better Call Saul, House of Cards, The Americans, and still, it found a way to win the most Emmys of any narrative series in history. But of course, more than any awards it received, the impact of Game of Thrones can be seen in the massive size of the fan base. When the show began, it averaged about 2.5 million viewers. But by season 8, that number was up to 12 million. AKA the amount of viewers of the 2023 NBA Finals. The show was such a pinnacle moment in entertainment history that almost all of the actors became household names, no matter where their careers had been beforehand. I mean, the show was a springboard to Star Wars, Doctor Who, and Marvel. I mean, hey, it was Eternals, but still, Marvel. And even if you didn't know the actors' names, the average person walking down the street knew something about the lore of Westeros. Phrases like the North remembers, and you know nothing, Jon Snow, and a Lannister always pays its debts became commonplace. Khaleesi entered the realm of the most popular baby names in the world, and the iconography of Thrones was impossible to escape. And all this for a show set in the world of epic fantasy, a genre historically difficult to portray to a wide audience. But nevertheless, they did it. They were on top of the world. And then season 8 rolled around, and things were different. Because George R.R. Martin's source material for the series was unfinished at the time of filming, as it remains unfinished for the present and potentially infinite future, the showrunners had to take the reins of this universe and essentially land the plane themselves. This was made even more difficult by the fact that they were very publicly working on a Star Wars project, which gave the whole season a feeling of being rushed into something that the fan base didn't recognize. Something that somehow, almost overnight, removed Game of Thrones from the culture completely. I still can't quite believe it. If you weren't around for this period of time, it almost felt like a fever dream. Because for years, Game of Thrones merch was in stores, references were made constantly. Sunday nights were vacated by every other show because they knew they didn't stand a chance against the power of Thrones. I mean, I was even in a fantasy league. And then it was over. Suddenly, people started to pretend like they never cared in the first place, and there was a very real possibility that this generation-defining event would be left in the dark. But lucky for us, we discovered something very, very important. George R.R. Martin may not have finished A Song of Ice and Fire, but he did write some other books. Now, this is the part in our story where I have to bring up J.R.R. Tolkien, the godfather of epic fantasy storytelling and author of a little series you may have heard of called Lord of the Rings. And I mentioned Tolkien because he didn't just write a trilogy of books and call it a day. He wrote tomes upon tomes upon tomes of history of his fantasy world, Middle-earth, some of which are still being newly published almost a century later as his notes are compiled. And yes, this rich history allowed Tolkien to fill Lord of the Rings with lore and complexity that made it feel more lived in than his contemporaries. But it also allowed more stories to be told within Middle-earth than simply the tale of Frodo and the Ring. And here's where we go back to Game of Thrones. While not quite as extensive as Tolkien, George R.R. Martin does have a collection of supplementary works about Westeros, the world in which Game of Thrones takes place. Most famous of these works is Fire and Blood, which tells the history of the Targaryen family and served as the basis for the spin-off House of the Dragon. That's right. With just 4 chapters and a few novellas, Martin was able to create a framework for this new show that spent 1 season reclaiming the glory of its predecessor and looks to do the same in the 2nd season coming up this summer. But the question is, how? Well, that's exactly why we're here. Even though the worldwide fervor of Game of Thrones has dwindled since its final season, House of the Dragon has the potential to reignite that flame and restore Westeros back to its former glory if it continues to do three very important things. Embrace the absolute epicness that made it famous, follow the actual source material as best it can, and ride the massive wave of legacy by embracing that which came before. And it all starts with the epicness. High fantasy lives on the scope of its narratives. I mean, think about it. When you mention Lord of the Rings, Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere, or Game of Thrones, you think of sprawling epics that takes place over huge continents with tons of characters, where the events within the stories mold not only the lives of the protagonists, but the entire history of the world, where the adventures undertaken by the heroes are so grand that they affect the fabric of the universe for generations to come. Now, Game of Thrones accomplished this task with a singular story that fulfilled the prophecy of the Song of Ice and Fire. But House of the Dragon is taking a slightly different approach to expand the scope of its respective tale. In order to fully dive into the history of the Targaryen line at this tumultuous point in their history, the showrunners of Season 1 decided to use a very simple, risky, yet effective tool: time jumps. From episode 1 to episode 10, House of the Dragon covers almost 20 years. Characters are recast as they grow older, months of time are simply skipped over between episodes, and somehow, it all works. Because by utilizing this type of storytelling, House of the Dragon is able to make every episode truly matter. By skipping around to the most impactful moments in Targaryen history, you know that every episode is going to feature something truly thrilling, and they deliver in spades. The stakes are always high, and the weight of the years of history build and build throughout the season until an entire generation of consequences is ready to burst by season's end. It's thrilling. Now, this epic setup of decades of history also works because it reinforces the literal title of the show, The House of the Dragon. This is not a show about a singular game or a singular quest. This is the saga of an entire house. Multiple generations of Targaryens feel the weight of the crown and its expectations, so by showcasing their struggles over the years, that magnitude grows outside the development and evolution of a single person, expanding the scope of the show beyond the expansion of land and conquest to the expansion of the power of multiple families. And obviously, the epicness of House of the Dragon goes beyond the logistical workings of the Targaryen family. There are the trademarks of the genre like intense sword fights, massive armies, and naturally, plenty of dragons. But when you combine those elements with the actual scale of a dynasty, you're left with something that defies any other descriptor. Now, aside from the sprawling epic timeline it boasts, House of the Dragon does have one additional advantage over its predecessor, Game of Thrones. Its history is already written. Thanks to historical legends in the original series, and most importantly, the tales written about in Fire and Blood, the eventual succession pattern of the Targaryens featured in House of the Dragon is already set in stone. In Dragonstone. Is that too much? Alright. And while simply sticking to the source material seems like a simple ask, doing so in a way that is simultaneously faithful and entertaining isn't always a guarantee. I mean, after all, adaptations are everywhere now. From The Rings of Power to The Wheel of Time, it appears that everyone is attempting to jump onto the epic fantasy TV show adaptation bandwagon that Thrones started. However, in doing so, they sometimes miss the point of what made Thrones so special for so long. Because here's the thing. Books are great. I know, revolutionary, shocking even, but they are. They can create entire universes out of nothing but descriptions, and they aren't constrained by actor schedules or effects budgets. Within their pages, authors like George R.R. Martin are able to construct universes with rich histories, family lines, and even magic systems. And when you take that full product over to an entirely new medium, you have to be very careful not to lose yourself in the process. Because let's be clear, Westeros is a miracle. The world that Martin has created over the last almost 30 years is a sensational, rich universe filled with lore. And luckily, we're able to witness so many different pieces of it in different mediums. But at the end of the day, it's special because of his singular vision, plain and simple. He knows everything about how it works, how it evolves, and how each puzzle piece falls on the board. And the key in adapting projects within this world is to never forget that fact. Because by sticking as close to the source material as possible, when it exists at least, you gain access to so many advantages. You're able to guarantee the quality of the story, yes, but more importantly than that, you ensure that all of the beats of the story are cohesive and the tone is consistent. Exactly the issues that plagued the last moments of Game of Thrones. And don't get me wrong, adjustments can be made here and there. After all, a lot of House of the Dragon isn't exactly found word for word within the pages of Fire and Blood, but the key is to not TVify the Targaryens as you do so. Because the creators of the show, and the fans for that matter, aren't interested in a do-over of Martin's work. They simply want to embrace this incredible story in a medium that is exciting and perhaps even more accessible to a larger community. For years, Game of Thrones was able to balance honoring Martin's source material with the utmost faithfulness, with making minor alterations as the story required, some of which were even lauded by Martin himself. And there's no reason that House of the Dragon can't continue that legacy in the years to come. Which leads us to our final point, the legacy. The one thing that the Game of Thrones universe needs to fully reclaim. The one thing that it absolutely can if they play their cards right. And so far, they've had a pretty good hand. Now, it needs to be acknowledged that spin-offs are an odd beast just by their nature. Because yes, House of the Dragon obviously wants to be its own thing and rise on its own merit, but literally everyone watching knows where you came from. It's pointless to deny it. So how do you balance that acknowledgement of identity with the desire to pave your own trail? Well, by embracing it. At a fundamental level, House of the Dragon is not embarrassed by the existence of Game of Thrones, nor should it be. As we said earlier, Thrones was a total phenomenon. I'm not sure if you remember, but they watched it in bars. A TV show. In bars, like the Super Bowl. And during the life of that show, the creators set up the world of Westeros absolutely perfectly. As an audience, we learned the families, the political machinations, the legends, the lore, even the geography. And House of the Dragon uses all of that prior knowledge to the fullest extent. In a way, all of that prior knowledge is essentially expositional currency. Because Game of Thrones did so much work setting up the world, the Dragon team doesn't need to waste time setting it all up again. Instead, they can take that baton and keep running without retreading the same basics, an especially helpful tool given their desire to jump through times to points of high conflict that we mentioned earlier. And with this attitude of acceptance and continuation firmly in place, House of the Dragon can add nods to Game of Thrones throughout the series to further cement their place in the same mythology. The most obvious example of this, of course, being the near replication of the iconic theme from the original series. Now, this isn't to say that every allusion to the original series has to be this on the nose, but there's nothing wrong with activating an immediate sense memory within your audience that they're in for something special. Beyond that, you have families like the Starks and the Lannisters popping up in key moments to reflect the attitudes of their future ancestors. And behind the scenes, you even have Rowley Earlham, the stunt coordinator from Thrones, acting as a stunt coordinator on House of the Dragon to ensure that the iconic battle scenes maintain the same visual language throughout the centuries. After the ending of Game of Thrones, there were plenty of fans that thought future Westeros projects should abandon the groundwork laid by the original series because they had such an immediate, intense, negative reaction to the final season. But ignoring the advantage of having a show that won almost 60 Emmys lay your groundwork for you is unbelievable. And it's an advantage that House of the Dragon has already used and will continue to use for years to come. House of the Dragon, on its own merit, is a fantastic show. The acting is exceptional, the story is thrilling, the effects and the world building are absolutely mind-blowing. Every single actor and crew member is clearly giving their all every single day on this project, and it shows in every episode. And all of this effort could have been in service of making people forget about Game of Thrones in favor of something new, something better, but they took a much smarter path. The show is not, at its core, a do-over. It is instead a reinforcement of just how beloved Game of Thrones is despite the final setback that almost took it out of the cultural consciousness forever. It's a reminder of how rich and incredible the world is, a reminder of why it has the potential to spawn an infinite number of shows, many of which are literally in production as we speak. And if House of the Dragon continues down this path of excellence and lends that quality to all of those projects currently in the pipeline, it will elevate the legacy of Game of Thrones higher than ever before. Now, will you be watching this weekend? Let us know in the comments below. And if there are any Westeros projects that have especially piqued your interest, I want to know that too. But until next time, may the Force be with you.